The town of Black Hollow was perpetually blanketed by an eerie mist that crept in from the surrounding marshlands. For as long as anyone could remember, the fog never lifted. It swirled through cobblestone streets, coiled around the crumbling chimneys of old cottages, and muffled the footsteps of anyone foolish enough to wander after sunset. Amelia Grayson was one such fool. She had moved to Black Hollow 6 months ago, fleeing the chaos of city life for the quiet isolation of the countryside. A journalist by trade, she believed small towns had stories to tell, real ones, not the hollow tales fed to her by publicists and PR agents in the city. But Black Hollow wasn't what she expected. The townsfolk were reserved, suspicious of outsiders. They spoke in hushed tones, their eyes darting toward the mist-shrouded horizon as if fearing it would overhear. The whispers began on her third night. Amelia had been jotting down notes by candlelight in her tiny rented cottage. The electricity here was unreliable, and the single bulb in her kitchen had flickered out hours ago. She was compiling an article about the strange traditions of Black Hollow, the annual lantern festival that no one seemed to celebrate anymore, the curfew that was strictly enforced but never explained, and the warnings etched into the town's sign at the entrance. Beware the whispers. At first, she thought it was the wind. A soft, sibilant sound slipped through the cracks of her window frame, rising and falling in uneven cadences. She paused, pen hovering above her notebook, and strained to listen. Amelia, her name, clear as a bell, though no one was near. The candle flickered. Shadows danced across the walls like restless phantoms. Her heart raced, but she forced herself to dismiss it. It was late, and the fog distorted sound. That much she'd heard from the locals. But as the nights passed, the whispers grew more insistent. They called her name, repeated fragments of her thoughts, and sometimes murmured things she didn't understand. Words that felt slippery and wrong, like trying to grasp oil with bare hands. One night, curiosity overpowered fear. Amelia wrapped herself in a thick coat, grabbed a flashlight, and stepped into the mist. The cold bit at her skin as she followed the sound. The whispers were faint, leading her down winding paths she didn't recognize. The fog seemed thicker tonight, obscuring everything beyond a few feet. The beam of her flashlight barely penetrated the murk. She passed the old churchyard with its crooked gravestones, the wrought iron fence rusted and jagged. The whispers grew louder. Amelia, come closer. Her heart thundered. She knew this was reckless, but she couldn't stop herself. Something compelled her forward, a pull that felt almost magnetic. She didn't realize where she was until her foot sank into the marshy ground of the hollow itself. This was where the fog was born, a low, sprawling expanse of wetlands dotted with gnarled trees and stagnant pools. The air was damp and heavy, carrying the scent of decay. Amelia's flashlight flickered, and for the briefest moment, she thought she saw a figure standing among the trees. "Who's there?" she called, her voice trembling. The whispers answered, a cacophony of overlapping voices. "Join us." "Stay!" The flashlight died. Panic surged as the darkness closed in. She turned to run, but the ground beneath her seemed to shift, pulling at her boots like quicksand. A cold hand brushed her arm. No, not a hand, but something far worse. Face materialized in the fog, pale and featureless except for a gaping black mouth that moved with the whispers. It was followed by another and another, until the mist itself seemed alive with them. Amelia screamed, wrenching herself free and sprinting back the way she'd come. The next morning, she awoke in her bed, disoriented and covered in mud. The memory of the previous night felt like a fever dream, but the bruises on her arms and the torn hem of her coat said otherwise. She tried to tell herself it was nothing, just her imagination playing tricks on her. But the whispers didn't stop. She started hearing them during the day, faint and fleeting, like someone exhaling just behind her ear. The townsfolk grew colder toward her, their wary glances turning into outright avoidance. At the general store, the clerk refused to meet her eyes as he handed her change. "Leave," he whispered, so softly she almost didn't hear. "Excuse me?" He said nothing more, retreating into the back room without another word. Amelia decided to do some digging. The town's library was a dusty, forgotten place, its shelves lined with moldering tomes that hadn't been touched in decades. She found a section dedicated to local history and folklore, and there, buried beneath years of neglect, she discovered the truth. Black Hollow had once been a thriving settlement, but in the early 1800s, a mysterious illness had swept through the town. It began with whispers, audible only to the afflicted, and ended with their disappearance into the marsh. Those who tried to leave the town were always found dead, their bodies horribly mangled. The few survivors had enacted strict rituals to appease whatever lurked in the fog, but over the centuries, knowledge of these practices had faded. The last entry in the journal she found was dated 1893. The fog cannot be escaped. We belong to it now. That night, Amelia decided to leave. She packed her belongings, threw them into her car, and drove toward the main road. The fog was thicker than ever, a suffocating wall that swallowed the headlights. She gripped the wheel tightly, her knuckles white, and pressed the accelerator harder. The whispers followed. Amelia. Stay. She glanced in the rearview mirror and nearly lost control of the car. The back seat was filled with faces, their hollow eyes staring at her, mouths moving in unison. Stay with us. Screaming, she swerved off the road. The car skidded, crashed into a tree, and came to a halt. Dazed but alive, Amelia stumbled out, clutching her bleeding forehead. She was in the marsh again, though she didn't know how. The fog coiled around her, thicker and darker than ever. The faces emerged, once more, countless and endless, their mouths wide with whispers that now sounded like screams. Join us. Amelia ran, but there was nowhere to go. The ground gave way beneath her, and she sank into the cold, wet earth. Hands, dozens of them, reached up to pull her down. The last thing she saw before the darkness consumed her was her own reflection, in the water, her mouth moving with the same dreadful whispers. The next morning, the townsfolk found her car, but there was no sign of Amelia. The marsh was silent, the fog unbroken. In the days that followed, new whispers began to weave through. Black Hollow, a new voice among the chorus. Help me.